Welcome to the Law Practice Exchange video series. I'm your host, Robert Schaller. This video discusses seller confidentiality. It's important that the seller understands that the seller's identity and financial information remains confidential until the seller is ready to disclose that information. So this video will discuss more about specific issues of confidentiality. So let's go up on the main menu to Seller Info tab. And you'll see on the second item, it says Seller Confidentiality. Click that. When you click that, you go to a Seller Confidentiality page, which will discuss four big issues. The first issue is location. When the seller lists a law practice for sale, the seller's city and state will be publicly identified, but the exact address remains confidential until the seller chooses to disclose this information. So, for example, if the seller is listing a practice in Chicago, Illinois, it will list Chicago, Illinois as a location, but will not list the address, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the buyer to know who the seller is. The next item is username. When the seller registers with this website, the seller creates a username. Now, to maintain confidentiality, the seller must be mindful of what username chooses. So, a username that's inappropriate would be using the seller's first and last name. So, for example, down here you can see I have attorney John Blackstone. Okay, we would recommend that John Blackstone not create a username of John Blackstone or Blackstone Law. Both of those names would lose anonymity because it's clearly associated with John Blackstone. So instead, a username should be more anonymous, like Estate Planning Attorney 45. That would be a great choice for an estate planner. But you could also put down any username at all. It doesn't have to be identifying the practice group. So you could put down George Washington or any other name that you choose. Just don't use your name or your law firm's name, making it very difficult for a buyer to know who is the actual seller. The next one is the law practice listing page. Let's scroll. On the law practice listing page, there are fields where the seller can identify client base, gross revenues, firm structure, and other confidential information. Now, when it comes to confidentiality, there are those people who will be feeling comfortable that since the username doesn't identify who the seller is, then that's good enough and they will list that confidential information. But there are other people who will be even more sensitive to confidentiality and they'll want to have the confidential fields like client base, gross revenues, and firm structure remain confidential. So for each one of those fields, there's a pull-down menu for information, and one of the pull-down menu items is confidential. So if the seller wants any one of those fields to remain confidential, they can use the pull-down menu and simply identify it as confidential. The next one is communication with prospective buyers. So let's talk about how does the buyer and seller get together. Well, the seller lists the law practice on the website, and the buyers will peruse the website. And if a buyer finds a listing that the buyer is interested in, the buyer has the ability to contact the seller. And the way they do that is on each separate listing page, there is a box called Confidential Seller Communication Portal. Okay? That's the Confidential Seller Communication Portal. And in that box, there is a button to click that says Contact Owner. And if the buyer clicks on the Contact Owner button, then an email interface form appears on the computer screen, and the buyer can identify the buyer by name and email address and include a message from the buyer to the seller, all while the seller remains anonymous. And then when the buyer clicks send, the email will be sent directly to the seller. It does not go to the website and it's not recorded by the website. It's a direct email communication between the buyer and the seller. So at this point, the buyer has identified him or herself, but the seller still remains anonymous because the buyer doesn't know who the email is being sent to. The seller then can receive the email and then choose whether to ignore the email, respond to the buyer anonymously, or respond to the buyer and disclose the seller's identity. But it's the seller's decision. So if, for example, the seller gets an email by somebody who the seller knows but doesn't want to do business with, well, they can just ignore the email. Secondly, if the seller wants to respond to the buyer but remain anonymous, The seller is urged to create a generic email address so that communications between the seller and the buyer remain anonymous as to the seller. So you can start, for example, a Gmail account and call it law practice selling attorney at gmail.com. Yeah, I just made that up. But you can see by using that kind of email, it will keep the seller's identity anonymous. So, for example, if you are from the John Blackstone law firm, you would not want to use an email address of John at John Blackstone Law Office, because that gives away the anonymity or loses the anonymity, and it defeats the purpose of trying to remain anonymous. So make sure if you're the seller and you want to respond by email, you create a separate email account that is completely anonymous. Okay, and finally, back to the third option, of course, the seller can disclose the seller's identity anytime the seller wants to. The next one down is customer avatar. In the client law practice listing page, there is an avatar. Okay? And the avatar for almost everybody is going to be a gray shaped blob. Okay? So it sort of looks like a person, but it's definitely grayed out, and it's technically called a mystery person. So there's no way that the buyer can identify the seller from that mystery person avatar, because it's the same for every single person, and it's just sort of a gray cartoon looking character. Now, be aware, though, that some people might have a custom avatar. Okay? I doubt many people have that, but there might be some people who have a custom avatar. And if the seller has created their own custom avatar outside of this website, independent of this website, then this website might pick up that avatar and put the avatar into the seller's listing page. And if that's so, confidentiality could be compromised. So if you have a problem with the avatar because you want to remain anonymous, but you have created a custom avatar independent of this website, just be on the alert that that avatar will be ported over into this website. And so if you don't want that, I'd recommend that you find the location wherever you created that avatar and delete the avatar. Okay? Again, you cannot delete the avatar through this website. The avatar is not created through this website. To delete a seller's custom avatar, the seller has to go to whatever website the avatar was originally created and delete it there. Okay, there'll be more about client confidentiality in other videos as we go through the video series, in particular the video that discusses the listing pages. Thank you for watching this video. Please enjoy the other videos in the Law Practice Exchange video series. Please contact us with suggestions and ideas using the contact form on the Contact Us page. Thank you again.